Maya's first day at school. The school bus rolled to a stop, its tires screeching slightly as it neared the curb. Maya Williams stepped off the bus, feeling the cool morning air rush over her skin. She clutched the straps of her backpack tightly, the weight of the unknown pressing heavily on her chest. Clearview High School loomed ahead, large, intimidating, and buzzing with the energy of students already filling the sidewalks. Maya had been here before, starting over in a new place, in a new school. It wasn't her first time being the new girl, but it didn't make it any easier. This was her fourth high school in just 3 years, and with each new start, the walls of isolation grew taller around her. The air was crisp with autumn, carrying the scent of freshly cut grass and the faint trace of pavement warmed by the summer's lingering heat. Students walked past her in groups, laughing, gossiping, already lost in their own world. They had their cliques, their friends, their roles. Everything Maya wasn't a part of. She knew the drill by now: find her locker, locate her classes, and most importantly, avoid drawing attention. She wasn't here to make friends. She was here to survive. As she walked toward the main doors, a few curious glances were thrown her way, but Maya kept her head down, doing everything in her power to blend into the background. She didn't want to stand out, not today, not ever. She wasn't the type to seek attention. She had learned time and time again that the less you said, the less people noticed you. The less they noticed you, the safer you were. The school itself wasn't remarkable. It was a typical suburban high school, filled with the usual characters, the football team, the cheerleaders, and the social hierarchy that came with it. To Maya, though, it was just another setting for her to remain invisible in. She didn't care about the popularity contests or who sat at the cool table in the cafeteria. The only thing that mattered was making it through the day without attracting unwanted attention. But life, it seemed, had a way of throwing curveballs at you when you least expected them. As she made her way through the crowded hallway, Maya's pace slowed slightly. She saw him then. Bryce Carter. He was standing by the lockers, surrounded by his usual entourage of jocks, all dressed in Letterman jackets. The way they laughed, the way they leaned on the lockers with such an air of entitlement, it was a sight Maya knew all too well. The alpha male, the school's self-proclaimed king. His presence filled the space around him, commanding attention from anyone within earshot. To Bryce and his friends, everyone was either beneath them or a target for their mockery. Maya didn't plan on drawing his attention. She never did. But as she passed by, she felt a sudden, deliberate shove to her shoulder. It wasn't an accident. Her books scattered across the floor, the sound of them hitting the tile echoing down the hallway. A few students turned to watch, and she could feel their eyes on her, some with amusement, others with curiosity. Her heart raced, but she kept her head down, forcing her hands to stop shaking as she bent down to gather her things. "Well, well, what do we have here?" a voice said, calm but laced with a mocking edge. Maya didn't need to look up to know whose voice it was. Bryce Carter. His smirk was already in place, and she could hear the chuckles of his friends behind him. She stood up slowly, still not meeting his gaze. She had dealt with this before. Bullies who thrived on humiliation, who fed off the discomfort of others. Ignoring them was the best way to diffuse their power. But Bryce wasn't done yet. "I don't think I've seen you before," he said, his voice carrying across the hallway. His tone was smooth, almost condescending, as if he already assumed she was beneath him. Maya didn't answer. She didn't need to. She gathered her books and walked past him, the weight of his gaze burning into her back. But then, just as she thought she could escape, she felt it. A tug on her backpack, sharp and insistent. She stopped, heart skipping a beat. She knew what was coming. His voice, again, this time louder, carrying across the hallway for everyone to hear. "Hey, where are your manners?" She turned around slowly, the hallway now feeling eerily silent, as if everyone had paused just to watch. Bryce stood there, arms crossed, a look of amusement dancing in his eyes. He was playing with her now, toying with her, like a lion watching its prey. But Maya didn't flinch. She met his gaze unwavering, unshaken. For the first time that day, she felt the tiniest spark of defiance. "You shouldn't have done that," Maya said quietly, her voice steady. Bryce raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by her response. Then he laughed, slow and mocking. "And why is that?" he asked, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. The whole school seemed to be waiting for her to answer, the tension building between them, but Maya didn't answer. She didn't need to. She simply turned on her heel and walked away, leaving Bryce standing there, his smirk faltering slightly. For now, the game was still his, but Maya wasn't afraid. She had learned long ago that silence could be more powerful than any word, more intimidating than any confrontation. She wasn't going to let him win, not today, not ever. And little did Bryce know, he had just made his first mistake. But Bryce's continued bullying. The day stretched on, each moment feeling longer than the last. Maya kept to herself, as she always did. She answered only when spoken to, avoided eye contact, and kept her movements as small as possible. The classroom felt like a battlefield, and she was just trying to make it through without being noticed. Despite her best efforts, though, she knew that Bryce wouldn't be so easily deterred. His type never was. By lunchtime, the weight of the school day had already begun to press on her. She found a quiet corner in the cafeteria, far from the chaos that unfolded at the popular kids' table. It was the same routine: sit, eat, and watch, all while remaining invisible. The clatter of trays, the chatter of students, and the shrill laughter filled the air as Maya tried to shut it all out. She was used to this. She had spent years perfecting the art of being overlooked. Across the room, Bryce and his crew sat at the center of the cafeteria, their usual spot. It was a place that radiated dominance, a table that seemed to come with an invisible crown for the king of the school. Bryce sat in the center, surrounded by his friends, their laughter loud and brash. Maya kept her gaze fixed on her lunch, focusing on the small movements of her hand as she moved the food around her tray. She didn't need to look up to know that Bryce's eyes were on her, and she didn't care. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of a reaction. She couldn't afford to. But of course Bryce wasn't the type to let things go. Maya had seen it before, the way bullies didn't know how to quit, how their arrogance only grew the longer they went unchecked. He hadn't gotten the rise he was expecting from her earlier, and now he was looking for another way to bring her down. She could feel the tension in the air, the way the students shifted around him, the way his friends kept glancing her way. He was plotting, and Maya was his target. When the final bell rang, Maya hurried to gather her things, eager to escape the suffocating atmosphere of the school. The heat outside was still thick, and she welcomed the warmth of the sun as she walked toward the bus stop. But just as she was about to check her phone, she heard it. The unmistakable voice of Bryce Carter. "Hey, new girl," he called out from behind her, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. Maya stopped in her tracks, but she didn't turn around. She knew what was coming. She felt him approaching, the weight of his presence pressing on her like a storm cloud. His steps were slow, deliberate, as if he were savoring the moment before the inevitable confrontation. "You got an attitude problem, you know that?" he said, his voice low but sharp. Maya didn't respond. She wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of an answer. She didn't need to. But Bryce wasn't done. He wasn't going to walk away so easily. He was the king of this school, and he was determined to remind her of that fact. He took another step closer, his voice taking on a more menacing tone. "What? You think you're better than me?" he sneered, his words laced with arrogance. For a moment, Maya considered ignoring him completely, walking away without a word. But something inside her shifted, something deeper than the fear or the anger she had felt earlier. She wasn't going to let him define her. Not anymore. Not today. A small, amused laugh escaped her lips, surprising even herself. It wasn't nervous, and it certainly wasn't afraid. No, it was something different, something that caught Bryce off guard. His smirk faltered for a second, and for just a moment Maya saw something in his eyes, curiosity, maybe even confusion. But then, his arrogance returned, masking whatever cracks had formed in his carefully constructed facade. She stood there, facing him, the weight of his presence still pressing down on her. But Maya wasn't intimidated. "I think," she said slowly, her voice calm and steady, "that you should walk away." The words hung in the air, and for a heartbeat everything seemed to pause. Bryce looked at her, his brow furrowed as if trying to make sense of what she had just said. It was clear that he hadn't expected this response. He was used to seeing fear, to hearing excuses, to feeling the power he so easily wielded. But Maya wasn't like the others. She wasn't scared. And that alone made him uneasy. His expression tightened, but he didn't move. Instead, he laughed, mocking, dismissive. "You think you're some kind of tough girl, huh?" Maya didn't answer. She didn't need to. She simply turned her back on him and started walking away. She didn't look back, didn't slow her pace. She knew Bryce wasn't done with her. She knew that he wouldn't stop until he had broken her. But for the first time that day, she didn't care. Because Maya understood something that Bryce didn't. She wasn't the one who was weak. She wasn't the one who needed to be afraid. And Bryce, well, he had just made the mistake of underestimating her. The turning point. The next morning, Maya woke up with a strange sense of calm. It wasn't the peace she had hoped for, but something more profound, something akin to a quiet strength that had been building inside her without her even realizing it. The events of the previous day had shaken her, yes, but not in the way Bryce had intended. Instead of breaking her, they had done the opposite. They had sharpened something within her, something that refused to be bent or crushed under the weight of his bullet. As she made her way to school, Maya knew that today would be different. The whispers of yesterday's encounter would have spread like wildfire through the halls, and the tension in the air was palpable. She could already feel it. The eyes that followed her as she walked through the gates of Clearview High. Students weren't just looking at her, they were waiting for something. They had seen the power dynamics shift, and they were eager to see what would happen next. Maya wasn't afraid. She had learned long ago how to make herself invisible, how to keep her head down and avoid the spotlight. But yesterday she had shown Bryce something he hadn't been expecting. That she wasn't like the others. She wasn't a target. She wasn't a victim. She walked into the school, feeling the weight of the stairs on her, but she didn't let them faze her. Her steps were steady, purposeful. As she moved through the hallways, the whispers followed her like a shadow. Some were filled with curiosity, others with amusement, but most were laced with uncertainty. There was a shift happening, and Maya could feel it. For the first time since she had stepped into this school, she wasn't the outsider. She was the center of attention, but it was the kind of attention she could control. She didn't expect Bryce to back down, and she certainly didn't expect him to let things go quietly. No, Maya knew that bullies like him weren't ones to retreat. They needed to dominate, needed to have control. And Bryce? He was about to learn what it felt like to lose that control. By the time the bell rang for lunch, the atmosphere in the cafeteria had already begun to change. Maya wasn't sure if it was the power of yesterday's encounter or the whispers that had spread through the school like wildfire, but there was an energy in the air, an energy that wasn't there before. As she entered the cafeteria, she could feel eyes on her from every direction. Some were filled with curiosity, others with disbelief. But Maya didn't let it rattle her. She walked past the popular table, past Bryce and his friends, without a second glance. But Bryce wasn't done yet. As she made her way to an empty seat in the back of the cafeteria, she heard his voice call out, sharp and loud, cutting through the noise. "Hey, new girl," he sneered, his voice carrying across the room. "You still crying over your little incident yesterday? Or you think you're too good for us now?" The words hung in the air, and for a moment the entire cafeteria fell silent. Maya could feel the weight of everyone's gaze on her, the pressure mounting as she stood there. She knew what Bryce was trying to do. He wanted to provoke her, to make her react, to remind everyone that he was still in control. But Maya wasn't about to give him the satisfaction. She didn't flinch. She didn't raise her head in anger. Instead, she stood tall, her gaze unwavering as she faced him. The calmness in her demeanor seemed to take Bryce by surprise. He had expected her to shrink, to cower under his words. But Maya didn't play by his rules. A slow smile spread across her face, one that was both confident and knowing. "It's funny," she said, her voice cool and steady. "How you keep bringing up my dad. Like you think it's some kind of joke. Maybe you forgot who he is, though." The entire cafeteria seemed to hold its breath. Bryce's smirk faltered for just a moment, and Maya saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes. He knew who her father was. He had heard the rumors, the whispers. But seeing him in the flesh, well, that was something entirely different. Bryce swallowed hard, trying to hold on to his bravado, but his jaw clenched and his posture shifted. Maya knew she had him now. She could see the cracks in his armor, the hesitation where once there was only arrogance. "What's the matter, Bryce?" Maya said, her voice smooth and controlled. "Don't tell me you're scared of me now." She didn't wait for him to answer. Instead, she turned her attention to the door of the cafeteria, where the sound of a deep, powerful engine rumbled in the distance. It was unmistakable, the kind of sound that made heads turn, the kind of sound that commanded attention. Maya's smile deepened as she pressed a single button on her phone, and within seconds the doors to the cafeteria opened. A sleek black car, an unmistakable custom Liesel sports car, pulled up to the curb just outside. The roar of the engine filled the air, and the unmistakable figure behind the wheel became clear. Michael Jordan. Bryce's face went pale. The confident smirk vanished from his lips, replaced by a look of disbelief, then fear. He had seen the rumors, heard the stories, but standing there in front of him, seeing it all unfold in real time, that was a different story entirely. Maya turned back to face Bryce, her expression calm, yet the weight of her words carried more than any physical confrontation could have. "Still think I'm just some random girl?" she asked, her voice steady, unwavering. Bryce didn't answer. He couldn't. His mouth opened and closed like he was trying to form words, but nothing came out. His friends stood behind him, uneasy, shifting their weight nervously as they waited for him to respond. But Bryce was too stunned to do anything but stand there, speechless. Maya didn't give him a second thought. With a smile, she turned and walked out of the cafeteria, past Bryce, past his stunned group of friends, and out into the open air where Michael Jordan was waiting for her. She didn't look back. The king of the school had just been dethroned, and Maya knew without a doubt that the game had just changed. Bryce's defeat and Maya's strategy. The days that followed Bryce's humiliating encounter with Maya felt like an eternal shift in the fabric of school life. What Maya had done was subtle, but the impact was profound. Bryce was no longer the untouchable king of Clearview High. The whispers were everywhere, curling through the hallways like tendrils of smoke, reaching into every corner of the school. The once infallible air of arrogance that Bryce carried with him had begun to falter, and every student who had once bowed to his power now watched him with a new, careful distance. Maya could feel the change in the air, the way people looked at her now, some with admiration, others with disbelief. It was a strange feeling, the weight of so many eyes on her, yet she refused to let it consume her. The power had shifted, but she knew better than to get caught up in the surface-level drama. Maya had never been one to seek attention, and she wasn't about to start now. She had done what she had set out to do. She had taken control of the situation without lifting a finger, without resorting to violence, without giving in to the games Bryce had played so many times before. She had shown him that intimidation and fear were not the only forces at play in this world. And now she would wait. Maya had learned over the years that sometimes the best way to win a fight wasn't to fight at all. Bryce was too predictable, too proud of his position as the school's alpha, and she knew that with his ego bruised, he would be itching to retaliate. But Maya wasn't about to rush in blindly. No, she was going to let him dig his own grave. Each day Bryce became more desperate. At first it was small things, snide remarks passed between his friends as they walked by her, a lingering glare when she wasn't looking, or an attempted shove in the hallway that fell short because Maya had learned long ago how to read the room. She could feel his anger, see the frustration simmering behind his eyes, and she knew that Bryce wasn't used to being ignored. That was his Achilles heel. He needed validation, needed the power he wielded to be recognized by those around him. Without it, he was nothing. Maya refused to engage. She refused to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. She knew that for people like Bryce, silence was the deadliest weapon. Every time he tried to provoke her, every time he tried to remind her of her place, she did nothing. She didn't flinch. She didn't shy away. Instead, she stood tall, her posture firm, her expression unreadable. The more she ignored him, the more Bryce's actions grew erratic. His friends began to notice. The quiet murmurings of doubt grew louder among them, and they started to pull away. The high school hierarchy was shifting, and Maya could see the cracks beginning to form in Bryce's once unshakable throne. Every time Bryce tried to throw another jab her way, it fell flat, leaving him more exposed than ever before. But Maya wasn't just sitting idly by. She was watching, learning, preparing. She knew that Bryce wasn't going to let things rest for long. He would lash out in some way, perhaps something public, something that would reaffirm his dominance, something that would force her to respond. But Maya had already anticipated this. She wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of any public confrontation. No, she was going to wait for the moment when Bryce, in his arrogance, would make the ultimate mistake. It came sooner than she expected. One afternoon, Maya walked into the school only to find her locker vandalized. The locks had been broken and her books were scattered across the floor, pages torn, scribbles all over the metal. It was the perfect setup for Bryce to prove his superiority, a clear message meant to push her over the edge. A few students stood nearby watching, some curious, some eager to see how she would react. But Maya wasn't bothered, not in the least. She didn't flinch when she saw the mess. She didn't allow the anger or frustration to rise within her. Instead, she bent down slowly, her movements deliberate, and began picking up the books, one by one. There was no rush, no sense of urgency. She stacked them neatly in her arms, unbothered by the eyes watching her, unbothered by the taunting words that Bryce and his friends no doubt had for her. As she worked, Bryce's gaze was burning into her from across the hallway, his friends laughing in the background. He was waiting for her to react, waiting for her to break. But Maya did nothing. She didn't give him the satisfaction of her emotions, of her anger. She simply stood, shut her locker, and walked away. That, more than anything, seemed to unsettle Bryce. At home that night, Maya sat at the kitchen table, tapping her fingers absently against the wood. Michael Jordan stood nearby, watching her carefully. Maya's mind was spinning, but her face remained calm, unreadable. She had just faced down her biggest challenge yet, and Bryce had failed. "They trashed my locker today," Maya said, her voice low but steady, almost as if she were talking about something trivial. Michael didn't look surprised. His brow furrowed, but he remained calm, as if he had anticipated this. "That's their best move?" he asked, his voice steady. Maya smirked, a glint of amusement in her eyes. "For now," she said, then took a breath. "But I think it's time for me to make my move." Michael raised an eyebrow, his gaze shifting slightly. "What's the plan?" Maya leaned back in her chair, her fingers still tapping lightly against the table. "I'm going to let him dig his own grave." Michael's expression softened into a grin. "Now that's my girl," he said. Maya knew that the fight wasn't over, but she was ready. She wasn't going to rush it. She was going to wait until Bryce made the mistake that would seal his fate, the mistake that would make him fall harder than he ever could have imagined. And when that moment came, she would be there, silent, patient, and in control. For the first time, Bryce wasn't the one who held the power. Maya did. Bryce's public embarrassment. It's funny how quickly things change when the illusion of power begins to crack. Bryce Carter, the self-proclaimed king of Clearview High, had always walked the halls with a swagger that came from years of dominance, of knowing that everyone in his orbit either feared or admired him. But in the wake of the events that unfolded between him and Maya, something had shifted. People who had once laughed at his jokes, applauded his antics, now looked at him with something new. Uncertainty. And uncertainty, for someone like Bryce, was a slow, creeping poison. Maya didn't go out of her way to make things difficult for him. In fact, she barely even looked at him. She knew that Bryce needed an audience to maintain his sense of control. He thrived on the reactions he got from others. He lived for the moments when everyone else fell silent and watched him shine in the harsh spotlight. But Maya was different. She didn't need the world to see her. In fact, she preferred the quiet corners, the spaces where she could be unseen, unheard. She understood, perhaps better than anyone, the power of silence. But Bryce couldn't handle silence. He couldn't stand being ignored. He was the center of the school's social universe, the golden boy, and Maya, she had made it clear that she didn't care about his crown. And that was the mistake he couldn't swallow. It had been a week since the day Michael Jordan had rolled up in his sleek black sports car to rescue Maya from the grip of Bryce's arrogance, and already things had started to unravel for Bryce. The whispers that had begun that day hadn't stopped. They had spread, weaving through every classroom, every lunch table, every hallway, and soon even those who had once been loyal to Bryce started questioning him. But Bryce wasn't the type to sit quietly and let his reputation slip away. No, he was going to make sure Maya paid for the humiliation she had caused him. The only question was how. The answer came during lunch one fateful day. The cafeteria, usually filled with the din of student conversations and laughter, had suddenly fallen eerily silent. Maya was sitting at her usual spot at the far end of the room, a quiet corner where she could eat in peace, when the familiar voice of Bryce Carter rang out across the room. "Hey, new girl," his voice carried, the challenge clear in his tone. "Still crying over your little incident yesterday? Or did you finally realize you're just out of your league?" Maya didn't flinch. She didn't react. She simply kept eating, unbothered, unshaken by his words. The entire cafeteria, however, seemed to pause in collective anticipation. Bryce had made his move, and now the game was on. Maya raised her head slowly, looking directly at him for the first time since their last encounter. She didn't engage in the petty back and forth that Bryce was hoping for. Instead, she smiled. A small, knowing smile that sent a ripple of discomfort through the room. The confidence she exuded was undeniable, and it made Bryce's usual charm seem weak in comparison. "Funny," Maya said calmly, her voice carrying in the now quiet room. "You keep bringing up my dad like it's some kind of joke. But maybe you're forgetting who he is." Bryce's smirk faltered slightly, but it was just for a second. Then, with a sneer, he shot back, "Who cares about your dad?" Maya's eyes never left his, and she leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice just enough for him to hear, but not enough to give him the satisfaction of a full audience. "You should care," she said quietly, "because you had no idea who I am, or who my dad is, and trust me, you're going to wish you had never crossed me." The room seemed to hold its breath as Maya stood up, and without another word she walked calmly past Bryce and his table, the entire cafeteria watching in stunned silence. Bryce's friends, who had once laughed along with him, now shifted uncomfortably in their seats, eyes darting between Maya and their leader. The confidence Bryce had always radiated was now gone, replaced by the uneasy shifting of someone who had just been exposed. Outside the cafeteria, the familiar roar of an engine signaled the arrival of Michael Jordan's car once again. The deep, unmistakable rumble of his sports car filled the parking lot, and the sound seemed to echo into the lunchroom. Bryce's face went pale. His cocky, arrogant smile melted away as the car pulled up to the curb, and Maya, with all the grace of someone who had long been accustomed to the power of silence, slid into the passenger seat without looking back. Bryce's mouth opened and closed, words hanging in the air, but he couldn't form anything coherent. His friends stood frozen, unsure of what to do, their eyes wide with disbelief. For the first time, Bryce was the one who had been upstaged, the one who had lost control. He had tried to force Maya into submission, but instead, she had turned the tables, making him feel small in front of everyone. Maya didn't need to say another word. Her actions spoke louder than anything she could have said. As Michael Jordan's car revved to life and pulled away, the students in the cafeteria watched in stunned silence. Bryce had been publicly dethroned, and there was no coming back from it. In the following days, Bryce became a shadow of the person he once was. His jokes no longer carried the same weight. His friends began to drift away, no longer interested in following the leader who had just shown them all how weak he really was. The rumors about Maya and Michael Jordan continued to swirl, but it wasn't just about who her father was anymore. It was about the power Maya had displayed. Bryce had been so certain that he controlled the school, that he could break anyone who dared stand against him. But what he didn't realize was that real power wasn't about intimidating others. It was about strength in silence, the strength to stand your ground when everyone expects you to fall. And in that moment, Maya had won. Maya had proven that strength wasn't always about confrontation. Sometimes it was in the quiet resilience, the calm patience, and the wisdom to let someone else's arrogance bring them down. Bryce had learned that the hard way, and Maya? She had gained more than just respect. She had reclaimed her power. If you've ever faced a bully or felt underestimated, remember that silence and patience can be the strongest weapons. Maya's journey shows us that it's not about how loud we shout, but how we carry ourselves when the world expects us to fall. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Share your thoughts below. How do you deal with bullying or difficult situations? We'd love to hear your story. Stay tuned for more.